Henry Thompson's trembling hand stopped mid-reach for the morning coffee, his weathered fingers frozen above the steaming cup as three massive shadows emerged from the Blue Ridge forest. The 74-year-old retired teacher's breath caught in his throat. These weren't just any bears, they were his bears. Doctor. Rebecca Williams dropped her medical bag with a sharp clatter, her face draining of color as she witnessed something that defied every scientific principle she'd learned in 30 years of wildlife veterinary practice. Sheriff Billy Ray Collins stumbled backward against his patrol car, his radio crackling with urgent calls he couldn't answer. Hank's mind raced back 5 years to 3 helpless cubs crying beside their murdered mother, remembering tiny paws that once fit in his palms, now grown into 400-pound giants who had somehow traveled 50 miles through wilderness to find him. The same bears he'd bottle-fed through sleepless nights, taught to forage, loved like his own children, and lost forever when the state took them away. "Sweet Lord in heaven," Billy whispered, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. How is this even possible? What had brought them back after all these years? And why now, when Hank needed them most? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Blue Ridge Mountains had always been Henry Thompson's sanctuary, but lately they felt more like a beautiful prison. At 74, Hank moved through his daily routines with the mechanical precision of a man who had forgotten how to truly live. The small cabin that once echoed with Dorothy's laughter now held only the hollow tick of the grandfather clock she'd inherited from her mother. 8 years. 8 years since Alzheimer's had stolen his wife piece by piece, leaving him to watch helplessly as the woman who had been his anchor for 43 years disappeared into a fog of confusion and fear. Dorothy had been everything, his best friend, his moral compass, the gentle force that had made him a better man. Without her, Hank felt like a ship without moorings, drifting through days that blended into one endless gray expanse. The 40-acre property sat on the edge of Virginia's Shenandoah National Forest, inherited from his grandfather who had built the cabin with his own hands in 1952. 3 generations of Thompsons had called this place home, but now Hank rattled around in it alone, his footsteps echoing off walls lined with photographs of happier times. Dorothy's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen windowsill where she'd left them, gathering dust he couldn't bring himself to wipe away. Each morning, Hank still set out 2 coffee cups, a habit so deeply ingrained that his hands moved without conscious thought. He would pour coffee into both, sit down with the morning paper, and carry on one-sided conversations with the empty chair across from him. "Storm coming in from the west, Dot," he'd say, his voice rough from disuse. "Remember how you used to worry about the old oak by the garden?" The online tutoring sessions were his only real connection to the outside world. 3 times a week, he'd help struggling students with mathematics, seeing their faces brighten when concepts finally clicked. It reminded him why he'd become a teacher in the first place, that moment when understanding dawned in a child's eyes. But even that joy felt muted now, filtered through a computer screen rather than shared in a warm classroom. Dr. Rebecca Williams stopped by occasionally, as much to check on Hank's well-being as to discuss the wildlife that frequented his property. She'd been Dorothy's closest friend and had appointed herself Hank's unofficial guardian angel, though he suspected her visits were motivated more by guilt than affection. "You need to get out more, Hank," she'd say, her voice carrying the familiar mix of concern and exasperation. "Dorothy wouldn't want you living like a hermit." But what Rebecca didn't understand, what nobody seemed to grasp, was that Hank had already given everything he had to give. He'd poured his heart into teaching for 38 years, loved Dorothy with every fiber of his being, and watched helplessly as disease ravaged the one person who mattered most. Now, at 74, he felt like an empty vessel, going through the motions of living while waiting for permission to stop. The forest beyond his windows stretched endlessly, full of life and mystery. But Hank saw it only as a reminder of his isolation, until the morning everything changed. The morning mist was just beginning to lift from the Blue Ridge peaks when Hank decided to take his usual walk along the property line. May in Virginia meant wildflowers pushing through the forest floor and the sweet scent of honeysuckle drifting on the breeze. Dorothy had always loved this time of year, when winter's harsh grip finally loosened and the world came alive again. God's own resurrection, she used to call it, her eyes bright with wonder at nature's annual miracle. Hank pulled on his worn hiking boots, the same pair he'd been wearing for 15 years, and stepped onto the familiar trail that wound through towering oaks and maples. The forest was his church now, the only place where he could still feel something approaching peace. Birds called to each other in the canopy above, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker drummed against dead bark with mechanical persistence. He was maybe half a mile from the cabin when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold, not the sharp crack of a hunter's rifle, but something more sustained and desperate. Crying, high-pitched and plaintive, like children in distress. Hank quickened his pace, following the sound through a dense thicket of mountain laurel. His heart hammered against his ribs as the crying grew louder, more urgent. He'd heard enough distress calls during his years in these mountains to know when something was seriously wrong. The scene that greeted him in a small clearing nearly brought him to his knees. A massive black bear lay motionless in a pool of blood, her thick fur matted and darkening around a bullet wound in her side. Beside her, 3 tiny cubs, no more than 2 or 3 months old, pressed against their mother's still form, their cries piercing the morning stillness. "Oh, dear God," Hank whispered, his voice catching in his throat. The cubs looked up at his approach, their dark eyes wide with fear and confusion. They were so small, barely the size of house cats, their fur still carrying the fluffy texture of infancy. One of them, slightly larger than the others, positioned herself protectively between her brothers and this strange new threat. Hank had seen enough of life and death to know that the mother bear was beyond help. The wound was too severe, the blood loss too great, but these babies, they couldn't survive without her. In the wild, bear cubs stayed with their mothers for nearly 2 years, learning essential survival skills. Without that guidance, they were as helpless as human infants. The smallest cub, a male with one paw wrapped in dried blood, crawled closer to his mother's face and began licking her muzzle, as if trying to wake her from what must seem like an unnaturally long sleep. The sight struck Hank like a physical blow, reminding him of those final days with Dorothy, when he'd held her hand and whispered her name, hoping against hope that love alone could pull her back from the edge. "I know, little ones," he murmured, slowly lowering himself to his knees, despite the protest from his arthritic joints. "I know what it's like to lose everything." The protective female cub, clearly the alpha of the trio, backed away as Hank approached, but she didn't flee. There was something almost human in her dark eyes, an intelligence that seemed to recognize that this stranger posed no immediate threat. Her brothers huddled behind her, the injured one still calling for his mother in heartbreaking whimpers. Hank pulled out his cell phone to call the wildlife authorities, then stopped. He knew what would happen next. They'd collect the cubs, take them to an overcrowded rehabilitation facility, and do their best to prepare them for eventual release. But the statistics were grim. Orphaned cubs this young had maybe a 50-50 chance of survival, even with professional care. "Sometimes doing right means breaking the rules," he whispered, echoing something Dorothy used to say when she'd sneak extra cookies to a hungry student or slip a $20 bill to a family struggling to make ends rent. He shrugged off his jacket, an old flannel shirt Dorothy had given him for his 65th birthday. Working slowly and speaking in the gentle voice he'd once used to calm frightened children on their first day of school, Hank wrapped the injured cub first. The little male barely struggled, as if he understood that this human meant help, not harm. "That's it, sweetheart," Hank murmured, cradling the tiny form against his chest. The cub's body was warm but trembling, and Hank could feel the rapid flutter of a hummingbird heart. "You're going to be okay." "We're all going to be okay." The other two cubs watched this interaction with the intensity of creatures whose lives hung in the balance. When Hank reached for the second male, a sturdy little fellow with bright, curious eyes, the cub came willingly, as if making a conscious decision to trust this strange new guardian. The female held out the longest, her protective instincts warring with desperation. She was clearly the leader, the one who would have grown up to be the fiercest and most independent. But even she seemed to understand that pride was a luxury her family couldn't afford. When Hank extended his hand palm up, she sniffed carefully, then allowed him to wrap her in the remaining fabric. The walk back to the cabin was the longest mile of Hank's life. Each step jarred his aging body, but he held the cubs as gently as he could, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed himself. What did he know about raising bear cubs? His experience with animals extended to the family dog he'd had as a child and the various classroom pets he'd cared for over the years. But as he looked down at the three tiny faces peering up at him with a mixture of fear and hope, Hank felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was buried forever with Dorothy. Purpose. For the first time in 8 years, he had something that needed him. Not just his knowledge or his memory of better times, but his complete presence and dedication. The injured cub whimpered softly, and without thinking, Hank began humming an old lullaby Dorothy used to sing when she worked in her garden. The sound seemed to soothe all three cubs, their trembling gradually subsiding as they nestled closer to his warmth. By the time he reached the cabin, Hank had already begun planning. He'd need formula, heating pads, medical supplies. He'd have to call Rebecca Williams. She'd know what to do about the injured paw. And somehow, he'd have to find the strength to become the father these orphaned creatures needed. As he settled the cubs in Dorothy's old laundry room, using her quilts to create a makeshift den, Hank felt tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. But for the first time in years, they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Well, Dot," he whispered to the empty air, "looks like you were right. God does work in mysterious ways." The first 48 hours nearly broke him. Hank had always prided himself on being a capable man. He'd raised 3 generations of students, cared for Dorothy through her final illness, and maintained a 40-acre property, largely by himself. But nothing had prepared him for the relentless demands of 3 orphaned bear cubs who refused to accept the artificial formula he'd hastily purchased from the farm supply store. The smallest cub, the one with the injured paw, was fading fast. His cries had grown weaker throughout the first night, and by dawn he could barely lift his head. Hank sat on the laundry room floor, cradling the tiny creature against his chest, feeling utterly helpless as life seemed to ebb away beneath his hands. "Come on, little man," he whispered, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Don't give up on me now." It was then that he did something that defied all logic and wildlife protocol. Remembering an old technique from his Army medic training 50 years ago, Hank tilted the cub's head back and breathed gently into his tiny nostrils. Once, twice, 3 times. The cub's chest rose and fell with Hank's breath, and suddenly, miraculously, dark eyes fluttered open. The female cub, who had been watching this drama unfold with the intensity of a worried mother, approached slowly. Without warning, she pressed her warm tongue against Hank's tear-stained cheek, a gesture so tender and human-like that it took his breath away. In that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. They weren't just a man and three wild animals thrown together by tragedy. They were family. That's when I knew I had to call Rebecca, Hank would later tell Sheriff Billy Ray Collins. Not because I wanted to give them up, but because I needed help keeping them alive, Dr. Rebecca Williams arrived within an hour of his frantic phone call, her emergency veterinary kit bouncing against her hip as she hurried up the cabin's front steps. A woman in her late 60s with steel gray hair and no patience for foolishness, Rebecca had been Dorothy's closest friend and the only person who could speak truth to Hank without fear of reprisal. "Henry Thompson, what in the Sam Hill have you gotten yourself into?" she demanded, but her voice softened when she saw the cubs. Professional instincts took over as she knelt beside them, her experienced hands checking vitals, examining the injured paw, assessing their overall condition. "This little one's dehydrated," she murmured, indicating the male with the hurt paw. "And they're all underweight. How long since they last nursed?" "Found them yesterday morning," Hank replied, hovering anxiously as Rebecca worked. "Mother was shot. Poachers, I think." Rebecca's jaw tightened. She'd seen too many cases like this over the years, magnificent wild creatures destroyed by men who killed for sport rather than need. "You should have called the wildlife authorities immediately, Hank. This is illegal on about 6 different levels." "I know," he said quietly. "But look at them, Rebecca. Really look. They chose to trust me." And it was true. While Rebecca examined them, the cubs remained calm in Hank's presence, the female even reaching out to touch his hand when her brothers showed signs of distress. It was unprecedented behavior for wild bears who typically feared human contact above all else. "I can get you a temporary wildlife rehabilitation permit," Rebecca said finally, closing her medical kit with a decisive snap. "But there are conditions. You'll need proper facilities, the right diet, medical monitoring, and Hank," she fixed him with a stern look, "these aren't pets. The goal is always to return them to the wild where they belong." Over the following weeks, Hank threw himself into learning everything he could about bear cub care. He read veterinary manuals until his eyes burned, watched YouTube videos on wildlife rehabilitation, and called Rebecca at all hours with questions that ranged from practical to absurd. The cubs' distinct personalities began to emerge as they grew stronger and more confident. The female, whom Hank found himself calling Bear for lack of a better name, was clearly the leader. She was first to investigate new foods, first to explore the expanding boundaries of their temporary home, and always positioned herself between her brothers and any perceived threat. There was something almost maternal about her protectiveness, despite her young age. The larger male, whom Hank dubbed Courage, was brave but gentle. He would approach new situations with caution but determination, and he seemed to have an innate understanding of when his siblings needed comfort. More than once, Hank found Courage curled protectively around Scout, the smallest cub, during thunderstorms, or when strange noises frightened them. Scout, the cub with the injured paw, had recovered remarkably well under Rebecca's care, but he remained the most vulnerable of the three. He was also the most curious, constantly getting into mischief that would have worried Hank more if it hadn't reminded him so much of the brightest students he'd taught over the years. Scout had a gift for problem-solving that astonished even Rebecca. "Watch this," Hank said one afternoon when Rebecca came for a weekly checkup. He placed a treat inside a puzzle box designed for enrichment, something that should have challenged the cubs for hours. Scout had it open in under 5 minutes, his small paws manipulating the mechanism with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "That's unusual," Rebecca admitted, her scientific mind struggling to categorize what she was witnessing. "Bears are intelligent, but this level of cognitive development in cubs this young is remarkable." As summer progressed, the cubs grew rapidly, their sleek black coats thickening and their playful energy requiring larger spaces for exercise. Hank constructed an outdoor enclosure adjacent to the cabin, complete with climbing structures, a small pool, and hiding places that mimicked their natural habitat. He spent hours sitting quietly nearby, watching them wrestle and explore, marveling at how quickly they were learning essential survival skills. But it was the smaller, quieter moments that touched his heart most deeply. Bear's habit of checking on her brothers before settling down for naps. Courage's gentle way of sharing food, always ensuring the others ate first. Scout's daily ritual of bringing Hank small gifts, interesting rocks, colorful leaves, once even a butterfly that landed on his nose and refused to fly away. "You know, this can't last forever," Rebecca warned during one of her visits. She'd grown fond of the cubs herself, but her professional training wouldn't let her forget the ultimate goal. "They're getting big, Hank. Bear's already 40 pounds, and the boys aren't far behind. Soon they'll be too large for home care, and definitely too large to be safe around humans." Hank nodded, though the thought of separation felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He'd known from the beginning that this arrangement was temporary, but somewhere along the way, these three orphaned creatures had become the center of his world. They'd given him a reason to wake up each morning, a purpose that extended beyond his own grief and loneliness. "I understand," he said quietly, watching as Scout attempted to teach his siblings how to fish in the shallow pool. "But they're not ready yet. They still need to learn so much." What neither Hank nor Rebecca could have predicted was how quickly external forces would complicate their careful plans. Richard Blackwood's logging operation had been expanding throughout the summer, moving closer to Hank's property with each passing week. Workers had reported unusual bear activity in the area, and complaints were beginning to filter into the county commissioner's office. The situation came to a head on a sweltering August afternoon when one of Blackwood's survey teams encountered the cubs during their outdoor playtime. From a distance, three healthy young bears looked exactly like what they were: wild animals that could potentially pose a threat to human safety. The report that reached Sheriff Collins painted a picture of aggressive bears threatening human workers, with demands for immediate wildlife removal. When Billy drove out to investigate, his heart sank as he realized what this meant for his old friend. "Hank," he said gently, standing on the cabin's front porch while the cubs played innocently in their enclosure, "I've got some bad news. The county's issued a 30-day notice. The cubs have to go." For the first time since Dorothy's death, Hank felt the foundations of his world beginning to crumble once again. But as he watched Bear lead her brothers in their afternoon games, he knew he'd been blessed with something precious, even if it was destined to be temporary. 30 days, he repeated softly. "Well then, we'd better make them count." The 30-day countdown felt like watching sand slip through an hourglass, each grain representing another moment Hank would never get back with his bears. November had arrived early in the Blue Ridge Mountains, bringing with it the crisp bite of approaching winter and the inevitable reality that Bear, Courage, and Scout had outgrown their temporary home. At 6 months old, they were no longer the helpless cubs he'd rescued in May. Bear now weighed nearly 60 pounds, her brothers close behind, and their playful wrestling matches had taken on a strength that could easily knock Hank off his feet. But it wasn't their size that broke his heart. It was the trust in their eyes, the way they still sought his comfort when thunder rolled across the mountains, the way Scout still brought him daily gifts as if sensing that their time together was precious and finite. The morning the transport team arrived from the Blue Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, Hank felt like he was preparing for another funeral. He'd said goodbye to Dorothy in a sterile hospital room surrounded by machines and monitors. Now he was saying goodbye to the creatures who had saved his life in ways they would never understand, standing in the autumn sunshine beside the enclosure he'd built with his own hands. Dr. Sarah Chen, the center's director, was a kind woman in her 40s who specialized in bear rehabilitation. She'd driven down from the Shenandoah Valley with her team and a specialized transport vehicle designed to minimize stress on wild animals. "Mr. Thompson," she said gently, extending her hand, "I want you to know how remarkable what you've accomplished here is. These cubs are healthier and more well-adjusted than any orphans we've seen." Hank nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. He'd spent the past week preparing the cubs for this transition, gradually reducing his direct contact and encouraging their natural wariness of humans. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done, watching confusion cloud their eyes as he maintained distance from the family he'd grown to love. Bear seemed to sense that something momentous was happening. She positioned herself between her brothers and the strangers, her dark eyes moving constantly between Hank and the unfamiliar humans. When Dr. Chen's team began setting up the transport crates, Bear's protective instincts kicked into overdrive. She huffed warnings, paced the perimeter of the enclosure, and kept looking to Hank as if expecting him to intervene. "It's okay, sweetheart," Hank whispered, his voice breaking despite his efforts to remain composed. "These people are going to take care of you. They're going to teach you how to be wild again, how to live the life your mother wanted for you." The tranquilizer process was carefully managed to minimize trauma, but watching the dart find its mark in Bear's flank nearly brought Hank to his knees. She stumbled, confusion replacing the fierce protectiveness in her eyes, and for a moment she looked like the tiny, frightened cub he'd first wrapped in Dorothy's old quilts. Courage was next, his gentle nature making the process slightly easier, though he whimpered softly as the sedative took effect. But it was Scout who nearly undid Hank completely. The smallest cub, perhaps sensing what was happening to his siblings, retreated to the far corner of the enclosure with something clutched in his mouth. "What's he got there?" Dr. Chen asked, peering through the fence. Hank's throat tightened as he recognized the object. A river stone, smooth and gray, about the size of a silver dollar. "He found it our first week together, and he's carried it everywhere since. It's his treasure." As the tranquilizer took hold, Scout carefully placed the stone at the base of the fence, closest to where Hank stood. It was a gesture so deliberate, so full of intention, that several members of the transport team stopped their work to watch. Even in his drowsy state, Scout was leaving his most precious possession as a gift for the human who had saved his life. "I'll keep it safe," Hank promised, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he knelt to retrieve the stone. "I promise I'll keep it safe." The drive to the rehabilitation center took 3 hours, during which Hank followed the transport vehicle in his old pickup truck. Dr. Chen had invited him to visit once the cubs had settled in, but he declined. Clean breaks were kinder for both the animals and the humans who loved them. Besides, seeing them in cages, even spacious, well-designed rehabilitation enclosures, would have been more than his heart could bear. The months that followed were the darkest of Hank's life since Dorothy's death. The cabin felt impossibly empty, without the sounds of bear cubs playing in the yard, without the daily routine of feeding and caring for creatures who depended on him completely. He tried to return to his old patterns, the online tutoring, the solitary meals, the evening walks through the forest, but everything felt hollow and meaningless. Rebecca Williams found him one December morning sitting in the empty enclosure, snow gathering on his shoulders and gray hair. "Hank," she said softly, settling beside him on the wooden bench he'd built for watching the cubs play. "You can't go on like this." "I know," he replied, his voice barely audible above the wind through the pines. "I know they're better off where they are. I know they need to learn to be wild." "But knowing something in your head and accepting it in your heart are two different things, Rebecca." She was quiet for a long moment, watching cardinals flit between the snow-heavy branches. "Dorothy wouldn't want this for you. You know that, don't you?" Hank fingered Scout's smooth stone in his pocket, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. Dorothy had 43 years with me. Those cubs had 6 months. It doesn't seem fair. Life rarely is, Rebecca agreed. But those 6 months changed you, Hank, for the better. You're not the broken man I was worried about last spring. You're someone who has loved and been loved in return, who has made a difference in the world. That matters. Through the winter months, Dr. Chen sent periodic updates about the cubs' progress. They were thriving in the larger, more naturalistic environment of the rehabilitation center. Bear had emerged as a natural leader among the other bears in her age group. Courage had formed a strong bond with another orphaned male and was learning advanced foraging techniques. Scout's intelligence continued to amaze the staff, who reported that he could solve puzzle feeders that stumped bears twice his age. They're being prepared for spring release, Dr. Chen wrote in her final update. All three have maintained appropriate wariness of humans while developing excellent survival skills. You should be proud of the foundation you gave them, Mr. Thompson. It very likely saved their lives. But even as Hank took comfort in their success, he struggled with a growing sense of purposelessness. The online tutoring sessions felt mechanical, his interactions with students lacking the warmth and engagement that had once made him an exceptional teacher. The forest walks that had brought him peace now served only to remind him of everything he'd lost. It was during one of these solitary walks in early March that Hank made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden among the rhododendrons near his property line, he found a series of wire snares, illegal traps designed to catch and hold large animals. His blood ran cold as he examined the crude but effective devices. Someone was poaching on or near his land, setting traps that could maim or kill any creature unlucky enough to stumble into them. The memory of the cub's mother, lying dead with a bullet in her side, flooded back with painful clarity. These snares were likely set by the same type of people who had orphaned Bear, Courage, and Scout. People who saw wildlife not as fellow inhabitants of the forest but as obstacles to be removed or trophies to be claimed. Hank pulled out his cell phone and began photographing the snares from multiple angles, careful not to disturb them. Evidence would be crucial if he wanted Sheriff Collins to take action. But as he documented the illegal traps, he heard voices approaching through the trees, rough male voices discussing trap placement and complaining about tree hugger interference. Hank crouched behind a massive oak tree, his heart hammering as two men emerged into the small clearing. One was a stranger, a weathered man in camouflage clothing carrying a rifle. The other was someone Hank recognized from town. Jake Morrison, a local handyman who did occasional work for Richard Blackwood's logging operation. "Boss wants these bears gone before spring," Jake was saying, checking one of the snares with practiced efficiency. "Says they're interfering with the new timber contracts. Doesn't matter if they're protected or not. Can't log with dangerous wildlife in the area." The stranger nodded, adjusting another trap. "These'll do the job. Big enough to hold a full-grown bear, strong enough that they won't get loose. Just gotta make sure we check them regular so the meat doesn't spoil." Hank felt bile rise in his throat. They weren't just talking about removing bears from the area, they were planning to kill them. And somewhere out in the vast forest of the Blue Ridge Mountains, 3 young bears who trusted humans despite every evolutionary instinct were learning to navigate a world where men like these waited with snares and guns. As quietly as he could, Hank retreated through the woods, his mind racing. He had evidence now, photographs that could put these men in prison for poaching on federal land. But would that be enough to protect the bears who were somewhere out there, including 3 he had raised from helpless cubs? By the time he reached his cabin, Hank had made a decision that surprised him with its clarity and determination. For 6 months, he had been the cubs' protector and teacher. Now, even though they were beyond his direct care, that responsibility hadn't ended. It had simply evolved. He had work to do. That evening, as he sat at his kitchen table uploading photographs to his computer and preparing a detailed report for Sheriff Collins, Hank felt something he hadn't experienced since Dorothy's death, a sense of mission that extended beyond his own grief and loneliness. The Cubs had given him purpose during their time together. Now, protecting them and others like them would give his life meaning for whatever years remained. Scout's smooth river stone sat on the table beside his laptop, catching the lamplight like a promise. Somewhere in the darkness beyond his windows, spring was stirring in the mountains, bringing with it the season when young bears would venture out on their own for the first time. Hank intended to make sure they had a world worth venturing into. Sheriff Billy Ray Collins arrived at Hank's cabin before dawn, his patrol car's headlights cutting through the October darkness like searchlights. The evidence Hank had gathered over the past months lay spread across the kitchen table. Photographs of illegal snares, recorded conversations captured on his old hunting camera, documentation of Richard Blackwood's escalating campaign against local wildlife. What had started as a simple poaching investigation had unraveled into something far more sinister. "This is bigger than we thought, Hank," Billy said, studying the photographs with grim intensity. His weathered face, marked by 30 years of law enforcement in rural Virginia, showed the strain of what they'd uncovered. Blackwood's not just trying to clear bears from his logging sites. He's systematically targeting the entire bear population in this region. The recordings were the most damning evidence. Hank's motion-activated cameras had captured conversations between Jake Morrison and Richard Blackwood that revealed a coordinated effort to eliminate bears through illegal hunting, poisoned bait, and strategically placed snares. But what chilled Hank to the bone was Blackwood's motivation, revealed in a heated argument with one of his own employees. "My daughter Emily died because this world went soft." Blackwood's voice crackled through the speakers, his words slurred with alcohol and venom. "Everything's got to be protected. Everything's got to be coddled. Well, not on my land, not in my county. These bears are killers waiting to happen, just like everything else that's wrong with this bleeding heart society." Billy turned off the recording, shaking his head. "He's lost his mind, Hank. Grief can twist a man in terrible ways, but this—" He gestured at the evidence spread before them. "This is about more than just bears." Hank fingered Scout's smooth stone, a habit that had become his anchor during the darkest moments of the investigation. Through careful research, he'd learned the truth about Emily Blackwood, a bright 16-year-old who had taken her own life 2 years earlier after struggling with depression and the crushing pressure of her father's expectations. She'd been one of Hank's students years ago, a gentle soul who loved animals and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. The irony was devastating. Blackwood was destroying the very creatures his daughter had cherished, convinced that eliminating weakness from the world would somehow honor her memory. In his twisted grief, he'd become the antithesis of everything Emily had stood for. "There's something else," Hank said quietly, pulling a sealed envelope from beneath the other documents. "Rebecca found this in Dorothy's things when she was helping me go through storage boxes. It's a letter Emily wrote before she died. It was never delivered." Billy's expression grew somber as he opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the teenager's careful handwriting. The letter was addressed to Hank, thanking him for being the one teacher who had listened without judgment, who had encouraged her love of wildlife despite her father's disapproval. "Mr. Thompson," Billy read aloud, his voice growing thick with emotion, "you always said that true strength comes from protecting things that can't protect themselves. I wish my dad could understand that. Maybe if he did, he wouldn't be so angry all the time. I hope someday he learns that love isn't about making someone perfect. It's about accepting them as perfectly imperfect." The letter went on to describe Emily's struggles with depression, her father's relentless pressure to be tougher, and her growing fear that she was disappointing everyone who mattered to her. The final paragraph broke Hank's heart anew each time he read it. "I know Dad thinks I'm weak, but taking care of the injured fox I found last month was the strongest thing I've ever done. Love makes us strong, not hard. I wish I could make him see that." "She was reaching out for help," Hank whispered. "If I'd gotten this letter, maybe I could have—" "Don't," Billy interrupted firmly. "Don't carry that burden, Hank. Emily's death was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. Just like this isn't her fault." He gestured toward the evidence of Blackwood's crimes. "A man is responsible for his own choices, no matter what pain drives them." As dawn broke over the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that Dorothy had always loved, Billy outlined the law enforcement operation that would begin within hours. Federal wildlife agents were coordinating with local authorities to simultaneously raid Blackwood's properties and arrest his network of poachers. The evidence Hank had gathered would be crucial in ensuring convictions. "We'll need you to testify," Billy warned. "Blackwood's lawyers will try to paint you as a vigilante, someone who overstepped his bounds. Are you prepared for that?" Hank nodded, thinking of the 3 cubs who were somewhere in these mountains, now mature bears navigating their first autumn as independent creatures. "I've been preparing for this moment since the day I found those snares, whatever it takes to protect them." But even as they finalized plans for the raids, neither man suspected that Blackwood had already moved to the final phase of his campaign. Jake Morrison had been watching Hank's cabin for weeks, documenting his routines, mapping his daily walks through the forest. The old man had become more than just an obstacle to their operation. He'd become a symbol of everything Blackwood despised about modern society's softness. "He's the problem," Blackwood had told Morrison during their final meeting. "That bleeding heart teacher fills kids' heads with nonsense about protecting predators, makes them weak and vulnerable. Emily might still be alive if she'd never met him." The plan was simple in its brutality. Make Hank's death look like a bear attack, validating Blackwood's claims about dangerous wildlife while eliminating the man whose evidence could destroy their operation. Morrison would lure Hank deep into the forest, leave him injured and helpless, then claim the bears had mauled him. It would be the perfect justification for their extermination campaign. As Billy drove away to coordinate the federal operation, Hank felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. For months, he'd carried the weight of protecting creatures he might never see again. Now, at least, he'd done everything in his power to ensure their safety. The evidence was in official hands. The arrests would begin within hours, and the illegal hunting operation would be dismantled. He spent the morning in Dorothy's garden, now restored to its former glory and expanded with native plants that would provide food for wildlife. The sunflowers she'd loved were past their prime, their heavy heads drooping toward earth, but they'd produced seeds that would feed birds through the coming winter. Everything in nature had its season, its purpose, its time to give life to the next generation. The call came just after noon. Jake Morrison's voice, carefully modulated to sound urgent but not threatening. "Mr. Thompson, this is Jake Morrison. I work for Mr. Blackwood's logging company. We've got a situation up near Sunset Ridge. Injured bear caught in one of our equipment areas." "Someone said you might know how to help." Hank's blood chilled as he recognized the voice from his recordings, but Morrison's performance was convincing. An injured bear would explain why someone might seek out a man known for wildlife rehabilitation. "What kind of injury?" Hank asked, already reaching for his jacket. "Looks like she got tangled in some cable wire. Still alive, but she's trapped and getting more agitated by the hour. We're afraid to get too close, but we can't just leave her there to suffer." The mention of a female bear hit Hank like a physical blow. Bear would be fully grown now, possibly with cubs of her own. The thought that she might be trapped and suffering because of Blackwood's operation made his decision for him. "I'll be right there," he said, grabbing his emergency medical kit and Scout Stone from the kitchen table. Something about Morrison's call felt wrong, but an injured bear couldn't wait for his suspicions to be confirmed. As he drove toward Sunset Ridge, Hank tried calling Billy, but the sheriff's phone went straight to voicemail. He was already coordinating the federal raids. Rebecca was in surgery at the animal hospital. For the first time in months, Hank was truly alone. The forest road Morrison had directed him to was barely more than a logging trail, winding deep into territory that bordered the national forest. As Hank's truck climbed higher into the mountains, cell phone service disappeared entirely. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow that reminded him of the countless walks he'd taken with 3 curious cubs who trusted him completely. When he reached the coordinates Morrison had given him, Hank found the man waiting beside a red pickup truck, his expression carefully arranged in lines of concern and urgency. "Thank God you came, Mr. Thompson. She's just up this trail about a quarter mile." I didn't want to get any closer without someone who knows about bears. Something in Morrison's eyes didn't match his worried tone, but Hank pushed down his unease. If there really was an injured bear, every minute mattered. He shouldered his medical pack and followed Morrison into the deepening shadows of the forest, unaware that Sheriff Collins and the federal agents were at that very moment discovering empty buildings and abandoned equipment. Blackwood's operation had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only enough evidence to confirm that they'd been one step ahead of the law. In his pocket, Scout's smooth stone pressed against Hank's palm like a talisman. Somewhere in these mountains, 3 bears he'd raised from helpless cubs were living the wild lives their mother had died protecting. Soon he would learn whether the love and trust he'd given them had created something stronger than the hatred and fear that drove men like Richard Blackwood. The trail ahead wound deeper into wilderness, toward a confrontation that would test everything Hank believed about the bonds between species and the enduring power of unconditional love. The blow came from behind, a vicious strike to the base of Hank's skull that sent him tumbling face first into the rocky forest floor. Stars exploded across his vision as Jake Morrison's boot connected with his ribs, driving the air from his lungs in a painful whoosh. Blood trickled down his neck from where his head had struck a jagged stone, and the metallic taste of fear filled his mouth. "Should have minded your own business, old man," Morrison snarled, his concerned facade evaporating like morning mist. He stood over Hank with a tire iron in his hand, his eyes cold and calculating. "All that evidence you thought you were so clever gathering, Blackwood's been watching you for months. Every photo, every recording, every self-righteous move you made." Hank tried to push himself up, but Morrison's boot slammed into his shoulder, sending fresh waves of agony through his already battered body. "There was no injured bear, was there?" Hank gasped, tasting blood as he spoke. Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the darkening forest. "Only injured bear around here's gonna be you when they find what's left. Amazing how a man can get careless in the woods, wander into the wrong territory, stumble across a protective mother bear with cubs." The full scope of their plan hit Hank like another physical blow. They were going to leave him here, injured and helpless, then claim he'd been mauled by bears. It would justify everything Blackwood had done, validate his campaign of extermination, and eliminate the primary witness against their operation. "Emily wouldn't want this," Hank whispered, pulling Scout's smooth stone from his pocket. Even now, even facing death, he found comfort in the small treasure his cub had given him. "Your daughter loved these mountains, Jake. She loved the wildlife you're destroying." Morrison's face twisted with rage. "Don't you dare talk about Emily. She'd be alive if bleeding hearts like you hadn't filled her head with nonsense about protecting predators. Blackwood's right. This world's gotten too soft, and it's killing our children." Another kick, this one to Hank's already injured ribs, sent him curling into a protective ball. The pain was overwhelming, making it hard to breathe, harder to think. Morrison wasn't just following orders. He was enjoying this. taking out years of frustration and misdirected grief on a 74-year-old man who'd done nothing but try to save orphaned animals. "You want to protect bears so much?" Morrison grabbed Hank by the collar and began dragging him deeper into the woods. "Let's see how they protect you." The forest floor scraped against Hank's back as Morrison hauled him toward a dense thicket of mountain laurel. Branches caught at his clothes, thorns tore at his skin, and every jolt sent fresh agony through his battered body. Above them, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that reminded Hank painfully of Dorothy's favorite time of day. Morrison dumped him beside a massive fallen oak, its trunk forming a natural barrier that would make escape nearly impossible even for an uninjured man. "This is perfect," Morrison muttered, surveying the isolated location with satisfaction. "Deep enough in the woods that nobody'll find you for days, maybe weeks, long enough for the bears to do what bears do." Hank tried to focus through the pain and gathering darkness. His ribs were definitely broken. Each breath felt like knives stabbing into his lungs. His vision kept blurring from the head injury, and he could feel consciousness trying to slip away. But somewhere in the haze of pain and fear, he could hear Dorothy's voice as clear as if she were sitting beside him. "You're stronger than you know, Henry Thompson." "You've always been stronger than you know." "Please," Hank gasped as Morrison prepared to leave. "Emily wrote me a letter before she died. She was reaching out for help, trying to tell someone about her pain. Her father never knew because the letter was never delivered." Morrison paused, his hand already on the rifle slung across his shoulder. "What letter?" "She thanked me for teaching her that true strength comes from protecting things that can't protect themselves," Hank continued, each word a struggle. "She said, 'Love makes us strong, not hard.' That's what your daughter believed, Jake. That's who she really was." For a moment, something flickered in Morrison's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the ghost of the man he'd been before grief and anger consumed him. But then his face hardened again, and he turned away. "Too late for pretty words, old man. You should have thought about consequences before you stuck your nose where it didn't belong." Morrison's footsteps faded into the distance, leaving Hank alone in the gathering darkness with only the sound of his own labored breathing and the whisper of wind through the pines. The temperature was dropping rapidly. An October night in the Blue Ridge Mountains could easily dip below freezing. Even if his injuries didn't kill him, hypothermia would finish the job long before anyone found his body. Hank closed his eyes and tried to summon the strength Dorothy had always insisted he possessed. In his hand, Scout's stone felt warm despite the growing cold, a tangible reminder of the love and trust he'd shared with 3 orphaned cubs who had given his life meaning when he thought he had nothing left to offer. "I tried, little ones," he whispered to the darkness. "I tried to protect you." That was when he heard it, a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. Heavy breathing just beyond the circle of fading light, the crack of branches under considerable weight. Something large was moving through the forest, something that had caught his scent and was investigating. Hank's heart hammered against his broken ribs as the sounds grew closer. Morrison's plan was working perfectly. Whatever predator was approaching would find an injured, helpless man, easy prey that would validate every argument Blackwood had made about dangerous wildlife. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had devoted months to protecting bears might die by their claws, providing posthumous justification for their slaughter. The breathing grew louder, accompanied by the distinctive huffing sound that black bears made when investigating something unfamiliar. Hank tried to make himself smaller, tried to control his fear scent, but there was nowhere to hide behind the fallen oak. His vision was too blurred to make out shapes in the darkness, but he could sense a massive presence moving closer, could feel eyes watching him from the shadows. "Please," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was praying to God or speaking to the bear. Please make it quick." The huffing stopped. In the sudden silence, Hank could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could smell the earthy scent of fallen leaves and the approaching promise of winter. Then, impossibly, came a sound that made his breath catch in his throat. A soft whimpering, almost like a question, the same sound Scout used to make when he was confused or seeking comfort. "No," Hank breathed, hardly daring to believe. "It can't be." But the sound came again, closer now, accompanied by the gentle snuffling of a large animal catching a familiar scent. Hank forced his eyes open, squinting through the darkness and his blurred vision. A massive shadow detached itself from the forest gloom, moving with careful, deliberate steps toward where he lay, broken and bleeding. As the creature moved into a shaft of moonlight filtering through the canopy, Hank's heart nearly stopped. The bear was enormous, easily 400 pounds of muscle and fur, but there was something achingly familiar about the way she carried herself, the intelligent curiosity in her dark eyes as she approached. "Bear?" he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief and desperate hope. The massive bear stopped at the sound of her name, her head tilting in a gesture that transported Hank back 5 years to a tiny cub who used to cock her head just that way when puzzling over a new experience. Slowly, carefully, she moved closer until her wet nose was inches from his face. Recognition flashed in her eyes like lightning illuminating a dark sky. This battered, bleeding man carried the scent of safety, of unconditional love, of a time when the world was small and warm and filled with gentle hands that fed and comforted. The protective cub who had once positioned herself between her brothers and danger had grown into a magnificent, wild bear. But somewhere in her ancient memory, she remembered a lonely man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return except the chance to love something that needed loving. Bear lowered her massive head and gently touched her nose to Hank's cheek, her warm breath like a blessing in the cold mountain air. The gentle touch of Bear's nose against his cheek sent a wave of emotion through Hank that was almost more overwhelming than the physical pain. For a moment that stretched into eternity, man and bear regarded each other in the moonlit forest, separated by 5 years and the vast gulf between civilization and wilderness, yet connected by something deeper than either species typically shared. Bear's massive form blocked the wind, her body heat radiating warmth that Hank's failing system desperately needed. She sniffed carefully at his injuries, her wet nose tracking the scent of blood and fear, but also recognizing something else, the familiar essence of the human who had once meant safety and love and endless patience with 3 frightened cubs. "I can't believe you're here," Hank whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind through the pines. "After all this time, you remember?" As if summoned by some invisible signal, 2 more massive shapes emerged from the darkness. Courage appeared first, his bulk even more impressive than Bear's, moving with the careful grace of a creature born to rule these mountains. Behind him came Scout, smaller but unmistakably the curious cub who had once brought daily gifts of river stones and colorful leaves. The 3 bears formed a protective semicircle around Hank's broken body, their presence so surreal that for a moment he wondered if he was hallucinating from the head injury. But the warmth was real, their familiar scents were real. And when Scout gently dropped something beside Hank's outstretched hand, the smooth coolness of Riverstone confirmed that this impossible reunion was actually happening. "You kept collecting them," Hank marveled, his fingers closing around Scout's latest gift. Even as a fully grown wild bear, Scout had maintained his childhood habit of gathering interesting stones, carrying treasures in his mouth like offerings to a beloved parent. But the reunion was interrupted by sounds that chilled Hank's blood. human voices approaching through the forest, accompanied by the distinctive beam of high-powered flashlights cutting through the darkness. Morrison had returned, and he wasn't alone. "Should be right up here," Morrison's voice carried through the trees, closer than Hank had expected. "Left the old bastard by that fallen oak. Figured it would take a few hours for something to find him, but we might get lucky." "This better work, Jake," came another voice. Richard Blackwood himself, his tone carrying the bitter edge of a man pushed beyond reason by grief and rage. "Everything depends on this looking natural. One old tree hugger gets mauled, suddenly everyone believes bears are the problem I've been saying they are." The three bears instantly tensed at the approach of humans, their protective instincts warring with their natural fear of mankind. Bear positioned herself directly over Hank, her massive body shielding him from view, while Courage and Scout flanked them on either side. Their breathing had changed, becoming the deep, threatening huffs that wild bears used to warn away potential threats. "Jesus Christ," Morrison's voice cracked with sudden terror as his flashlight beam found them. "There's 3 of them. 3 goddamn bears." Blackwood's light joined Morrison's, illuminating the incredible scene, an injured man surrounded by a protective wall of massive black bears who showed no inclination to flee. "This is perfect," Blackwood breathed, his voice filled with vicious satisfaction. "Even better than we planned. They're actually defending him. When people hear about this, they'll understand why these predators have to be eliminated." Courage rose onto his hind legs, towering nearly 8 feet tall in the flashlight beams, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to swallow the surrounding forest. The sound that emerged from his throat was something between a roar and a warning, a declaration that said more clearly than words that anyone who threatened the injured man would have to go through him first. "Shoot them!" Blackwood ordered, his voice rising with hysteria. "Shoot all 3. We'll say they were mauling Thompson when we found them. Self-defense." Morrison's hand shook as he raised his rifle, but his aim wavered as he faced down 3 massive bears who showed no fear of humans, only implacable determination to protect the man who lay between them. "Rich, maybe we should—" "Shoot them!" Blackwood screamed, his own weapon coming up as years of misdirected rage finally found their target. "These monsters killed my daughter. They kill everything good and innocent in this world." The first shot shattered the mountain stillness, the muzzle flash temporarily blinding everyone in the clearing. The bullet struck a tree inches from Scout's head, sending bark flying in a spray of splinters. But instead of fleeing, the 3 bears pressed closer to Hank, their protective circle tightening rather than breaking. Bear's response was swift and decisive. She lunged toward Morrison with a speed that seemed impossible for such a massive creature, her powerful forepaws striking his rifle aside as he tried to work the bolt for another shot. The weapon flew into the darkness, clattering against rocks as Morrison stumbled backward in terror. Courage moved toward Blackwood with the implacable advance of an avalanche, his dark eyes fixed on the man who had caused so much death and suffering in these mountains. Blackwood fired wildly, panic destroying his aim as 400 pounds of protective fury bore down on him. "They're not attacking," Hank realized, his voice lost in the chaos but his insight crystal clear. "They're disarming. They're protecting, not killing." Indeed, both Bear and Courage seemed focused on neutralizing the weapons rather than harming the men who wielded them. With surgical precision, Bear knocked Morrison's second rifle from his hands, while Courage used his massive bulk to force Blackwood against a tree, pinning him there without using claws or teeth. Scout remained beside Hank, his intelligent eyes moving between his siblings and the injured man, as if calculating the best way to help in this impossible situation. When Blackwood broke free and made a desperate lunge for his fallen weapon, Scout moved with lightning speed, placing his considerable bulk between the gun and the man who would use it to kill his family. "Stop!" The voice that cut through the chaos belonged to Sheriff Billy Ray Collins, his powerful flashlight beams sweeping across the surreal scene as he and 3 federal agents emerged from the forest. "Drop your weapons." Everyone back away slowly. But instead of the bloodbath the lawmen expected to find, they discovered something that defied everything they thought they knew about human-wildlife interactions. 3 massive wild bears stood protectively around an injured man, while 2 other humans cowered nearby, their weapons scattered across the forest floor. "Billy," Hank called weakly, his voice barely carrying above the heavy breathing of stressed bears and panicked men. "They saved me. The bears, they saved my life." Dr. Rebecca Williams appeared behind the officers, her medical bag already in hand as she assessed the situation with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to wildlife emergencies. "Everyone stay very still," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent working with dangerous animals. "These bears aren't acting aggressively. They're protecting him." Slowly, carefully, Rebecca approached the protective circle, speaking in the gentle tone she'd used during countless wildlife interventions. "It's okay, beautiful ones. We're here to help. No one's going to hurt you or your human." Bear's massive head turned toward the familiar voice, recognition flickering in her dark eyes. This was the woman who had helped care for them as cubs, who had guided their rehabilitation and eventual release. Gradually, incrementally, Bear stepped aside to allow Rebecca access to Hank's broken body. "Remarkable," one of the federal agents breathed as he watched Scout carefully retrieve his scattered stones, arranging them in a neat pile beside Hank, as if creating a barrier of treasures to protect his beloved human. "I've never seen behavior like this in wild bears." As Rebecca worked to stabilize Hank's injuries, preparing him for emergency transport, the 3 bears maintained their vigil. They allowed the humans to help their injured protector, but they made it clear through posture and positioning that they were prepared to intervene if anyone posed a threat. Morrison and Blackwood were taken into custody without resistance, their weapons confiscated as evidence. Both men seemed broken by what they'd witnessed, their worldview shattered by the reality of wild animals showing more humanity than they had managed. "The helicopter's 5 minutes out," Billy reported, coordinating the medical evacuation while keeping a respectful distance from the bears. "Can you keep him stable until then?" Rebecca nodded, her experienced hands working to stop the bleeding and immobilize Hank's broken ribs. "He's tougher than he looks. Always has been." As the sound of rotor blades filled the mountain air, the 3 bears began to withdraw toward the forest edge. Their job was done. Their human was safe, surrounded by people who would care for him. But before disappearing entirely, Bear approached one last time. She gently nuzzled Hank's hand, her warm breath like a benediction in the cold mountain air. In that touch, 5 years collapsed into a single moment of perfect understanding. The tiny cub he'd saved had grown into a magnificent wild creature, but somewhere in her ancient heart, she carried the memory of love freely given and trust earned through countless acts of kindness. "Thank you," Hank whispered as the helicopter touched down, its downdraft scattering leaves across the forest floor. "Thank you for remembering." As the medical team loaded him onto the stretcher, Hank's last coherent image was of 3 massive bears silhouetted against the moonlit forest, standing guard until the helicopter lifted him safely into the sky. In his hand, Scout's latest stone felt warm with the promise that some bonds transcend species, time, and the vast gulf between the civilized and wild worlds. Love, once given freely, never truly dies. It simply changes form, waiting for the moment when it's needed most to reveal itself in all its transformative power. 6 months later, Henry Thompson stood on the front porch of his cabin, watching the morning sun paint the Blue Ridge Mountains in shades of gold and amber that would have made Dorothy smile. The scars from that October night had healed. 3 broken ribs, a severe concussion, and countless cuts and bruises that had finally faded into memory. But the deeper changes, the ones that mattered most, remained as vivid as the day 3 magnificent bears had risked everything to save his life. The wooden sign beside his front door read, "Dorothy's Dream Wildlife Education Center," hand-carved by local artisan Marcus Webb as a donation to the cause. What had once been Hank's private retreat had transformed into something far more meaningful. A place where children and adults alike could learn about the delicate balance between human civilization and the wild world that surrounded them. This morning, like every morning for the past month, Hank set out 3 coffee cups on the kitchen table. The third cup wasn't for Dorothy's memory, though her photograph still held the place of honor beside the window, but for the unexpected guest who had become an integral part of his new life. "Good morning, Rick," Hank called as footsteps approached on the gravel path. "Coffee's ready." Richard Blackwood appeared around the corner of the cabin, his appearance dramatically changed from the bitter, rage-filled man who had orchestrated the campaign against local wildlife. 6 months of intensive therapy, community service, and genuine soul-searching had stripped away the hard edges of anger, revealing someone Hank was slowly learning to respect, if not yet fully trust. "Morning, Hank," Rick replied, settling into the chair that had become his usual spot. His voice carried the weight of someone still learning to live with the consequences of his actions. "The Martinez family should be here by 9. Their daughter Sophia is the one who wrote the essay about wanting to become a wildlife veterinarian." The transformation in Rick had been as remarkable as it was unexpected. During the legal proceedings that followed his arrest, Emily's letter had been read aloud in court. Her words about love making people strong rather than hard, about the importance of protecting things that couldn't protect themselves. The impact on her father had been immediate and devastating, shattering the wall of anger and resentment he'd built around his grief. "She was trying to tell me something," Rick had sobbed during one of their early conversations in the hospital, where Hank was recovering from his injuries. "All those years, Emily was trying to show me who she really was, and I was too busy trying to make her into what I thought she should be." The legal consequences had been severe but fair. Rick faced 5 years of probation, substantial fines, and 1,000 hours of community service specifically related to wildlife conservation. Jake Morrison had received a harsher sentence, 2 years in federal prison for assault and conspiracy to commit poaching. But for Rick, the real punishment was living with the knowledge of how far he'd strayed from the values his daughter had held dear. The education center had been his idea, a way to honor Emily's memory while channeling his business skills toward something constructive. He donated his logging rights to the state for permanent conservation, sold his equipment to fund the center's operations, and dedicated himself to learning everything he could about the wildlife his daughter had loved. "You know," Rick said quietly, watching a pair of cardinals flit between the bird feeders Hank had installed around the property, "Emily would have loved this place. She always talked about wanting to help injured animals." Hank nodded, stirring his coffee with the slow deliberation of a man who had learned to savor quiet moments. "She wrote about finding that injured fox, about how caring for it made her feel strong. I think she would have made an excellent veterinarian." The center hosted school groups 3 days a week, teaching children about wildlife behavior, conservation, and the importance of coexistence. Hank had discovered that his decades of classroom experience translated perfectly to this new venue, and Rick's business acumen had proved invaluable in organizing tours, managing logistics, and securing funding. But the most remarkable aspect of the center wasn't the educational programs or the donated equipment. It was the regular visits from 3 wild bears who seemed to understand that this place was special, protected, a sanctuary where the artificial boundaries between human and wildlife dissolved into something approaching harmony. "They're here," Rick said suddenly, pointing toward the forest edge where three familiar shapes had emerged into the morning sunlight. Bear appeared first, magnificent in her prime, her dark coat gleaming with health and vitality. Behind her came two cubs, born the previous spring and now thriving under their mother's expert care. Courage and Scout flanked the small family group, their protective instincts as strong as ever, though their focus had expanded to include the next generation. Every Tuesday and Friday, Hank marveled, as he had every week for the past 2 months. They come to show the cubs that humans aren't always dangerous, that some of us can be trusted. The bears maintained a respectful distance, perhaps 50 yards from the cabin, but their presence was unmistakable. Scout, true to his nature, had left a small pile of interesting stones near the forest edge, gifts that Hank collected and displayed in the center's main room, each one a testament to the enduring bond between species. "The children love seeing them," Rick observed. "Yesterday, little Miguel asked me if the bears remember being babies here. I told him I thought they did, that love creates memories that last forever." It was a conversation Rick would never have imagined having 6 months earlier, when his heart was poisoned by grief and his mind clouded by misdirected rage. The journey from that darkness to this peaceful morning had been neither easy nor quick, but it had been necessary, for him, for Emily's memory, and for the healing that could only come through confronting the truth about his own actions. Dr. Rebecca Williams arrived shortly before 9, bringing with her the Martinez family and 3 other children whose parents had enrolled them in the center's summer program. As the group gathered on the front porch, the bears remained visible at the forest edge, a living reminder that wildness and civilization could coexist when approached with respect and understanding. "Welcome to Dorothy's dream," Hank began, his voice carrying the warmth and enthusiasm that had made him a beloved teacher for nearly 4 decades. "Today we're going to learn about one of the most remarkable relationships in nature, the bond between a mother bear and her cubs, and how that bond can extend beyond family to include the humans who share their world." As he spoke, Scout carefully approached the stone pile he'd created, adding one more treasure to the collection. Even at this distance, Hank could see that it was perfectly smooth, worn by countless years in mountain streams, a gift as precious as the trust that had made it possible. The morning sun climbed higher over the Blue Ridge Mountains, warming a world where love had proven stronger than hatred, where healing had triumphed over revenge, and where 3 orphaned cubs had grown into magnificent bears who carried in their hearts the memory of an old man's kindness. Sometimes, Hank reflected as he watched the children's faces light up with wonder, the greatest education came not from textbooks or lectures, but from witnessing the simple miracle of love returned when it was needed most. When Henry Thompson rescued those 3 bear cubs, he thought he was saving them. He never imagined that 5 years later they would save his life in return. This incredible true story reminds us that love never dies. It just changes form, waiting for the moment when we need it most. At 74, Henry had lost his beloved wife Dorothy and felt his purpose slipping away until 3 orphaned creatures gave him a reason to live again. Their bond transcended every scientific explanation, every barrier between wild and civilized worlds. When Henry lay broken and bleeding in that dark forest, betrayed by those who should have protected him, his children remembered. They came back not as wild animals, but as family, fierce, loyal, and unafraid to risk everything for the man who had loved them unconditionally. For those of us who sometimes wonder if our lives still matter, if anyone would remember our kindness, Henry's story is a powerful reminder. Every act of love creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. True love doesn't end when someone leaves us. It transforms, endures, and often returns when we least expect it, but need it most. What memories of unconditional love have sustained you through your darkest moments? Have you ever experienced an unexpected return of kindness you once gave freely?